Today is part 2 of the experimental pilot we're doing on the topic of justice. If you want an explanation of this, you need to listen to yesterday's podcast. I would urge you to do that because I gave an explanation of this whole new format that I'm trying out and why I'm doing it. So dial up yesterday's podcast, listen to the episode on justice and that topic in the current headlines. And then for today, we're going to listen to an excerpt from a sermon from 1 Samuel about David and his quest for justice, how he handled injustice. So today's podcast is going to be helpful for you if you are suffering unfairness or injustice and you want to know how to handle that. This is from the sermon titled Swapping Battles from 1 Samuel 25.
David is suffering two really hard things, betrayal and unfairness. Saul offers his daughters for David to marry, keeps promoting him in the military, pretending to do good for David. All of those are efforts to kill David, but they all seem like acts of kindness. Now, eventually it's going to become clear to David what's going on, and that really hurt David when he discovered that, when he found out that he's actually being betrayed by this man that he cares for, he loves and respects. David wrote about what that's like for him in Psalm 55, what it's like to be betrayed. Psalm 55:21, his speech is smooth as butter, yet war is in his heart. His words are more soothing than oil, yet they're drawn swords. You ever experienced that? You get words and this is soothing oil, and you find out later, no, it was a sword. It was betrayal. And not only did David have to deal with Saul's betrayal, but he also had to deal with the terrible pain of unfairness and injustice. Saul's whole plan to use marriage of his daughters to push David into dangerous warfare was actually illegal. You can't do that. Deuteronomy 24:5. If a man has recently married, this is part of the law of Israel. If a man is recently married, he must not be sent to war or to have any other duty laid on him. For 1 year he is to be free and stay home and bring happiness to the wife he's married. The law in Israel was the first year, no, you couldn't be sent off to warfare or have any other duty laid on you. And that's David's God-given civil right. And it was stripped away by Saul. So how do you deal with those kinds of things when that kind of unfairness happens to you? Some of you know what it's like to be betrayed. To have somebody pretend to be showing kindness to you, and in reality they're stabbing you in the back. They're nothing but smiles and hugs to your face, but behind your back they're gossiping about you, lying about you, turning people against you. Or maybe for you it's not that severe. Maybe they didn't intentionally hurt you, or they just let you down. They were unfaithful to you as a spouse or maybe as a friend. What they were to your face turned out to be different from what they were behind your back. What do you do when you're betrayed by someone you love or respect? How do you handle the pain of that? Maybe the person even apologizes and repents, but still, how do you deal with the damage, that's ongoing damage that's been done? How do you live with that without getting angry every time you remember it and you're reminded of it? And what about when somebody treats you unfairly? When they take away what's rightfully yours? When they steal from you? How do you deal with the unfairness of that? How do you handle it when your mom and dad say no to you because they're assuming something that's not even true and it's not fair? Or when your teacher punishes you for something that you didn't even do? Or when your boss docks your pay or gives you bad review for no good reason? Or you get stuck having to pay for somebody else's mistake? Somehow when you're in those situations, your dad's old speech about life's not fair, get over it, just doesn't bring a lot of comfort. Right? How do you handle the unfairness of life? Let's look at David's response. David's response is absolutely amazing. Let's just run through the list of everything David says and does in this chapter. In verses 5 and 13, he faithfully does everything Saul tells him to do. Even at the risk of his own life, he obeys Saul. In verse 10, he plays the harp for Saul to try to help him with the torment of the demon. Stays there even after one murder attempt. Doesn't even leave until after the second one. Verses 18 and 23, he declines the opportunity to marry Saul's daughter because he's a nobody and he considers himself unworthy. Just humility. In verse 27, he gives Saul double the bride price. These are the things that David does and says in this chapter. And then even more striking than that are the things that he doesn't do and say. There's no trace of any anger, no trace of any animosity, revenge, bitterness, disrespect even. Nothing like anything like that. None of it. David's humility is a beautiful thing in this chapter. It's a rare man who can have everyone in the nation singing his praises, women dancing in the streets over him, and not let that go to his head. Most of us, we put our trophies on display on a big shelf somewhere where it's prominent. People can see what we've done. David didn't care about any of that. In fact, I was thinking about David's greatest trophy. Probably Goliath's sword, I think, is probably the biggest trophy he ever won. And he prized it. He took that thing, put it in his tent, it says in chapter 17. But the amazing thing to me is when you get to chapter 1, somehow he's lost track of it. He goes to Shiloh. It ends up in Shiloh somehow with the priest. He goes to Shiloh. He's looking for a sword. You got anything? Yeah, we got Goliath's sword. Oh, yeah, that'll do. He didn't even know it was there. He just lost track of it somewhere. He didn't care. He didn't care about trophies or status or any kind of self-exaltation. And even more amazing than that is his respect for Saul. Saul is dominated by murderous hatred for David, and yet David speaks about Saul only with the most reverent and respectful terms all the time. He's submissive to Saul, obedient to Saul, loyal to Saul. He does everything he can possibly do to be a good servant to this king who hated him. David loved his enemies. He loved his enemies. When David was a king, it was a little different because an attack against the king of Israel is an attack on God, and so it has to be handled different. But when it was just an attack on David the individual, David's tendency was to love his enemies. Psalm 35:12, amazing passage. It says, "They repay me for evil for good, and leave my soul forlorn." You ever had someone like that? You do good to them, they repay you with evil. Yet, when they were ill, I put on sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting. When my prayers returned to me unanswered, he's praying for their healing. God doesn't heal them. God doesn't answer the prayer. When that happened, I went about mourning as though for my friend or brother. I bowed my head in grief and as though weeping for my mother. But when I stumbled, they gathered in glee. This is amazing. You imagine having an enemy who hates you so much, they gather in glee and have a party anytime you stumble, and loving that enemy so much that when they get sick, you're fasting and mourning and grieving and bowing your head and weeping like you would for your own mother? How do you get this kind of love? How do you have such a response to somebody who's trying to kill you? Who's treating you unfairly, taking away your rights, betraying you, lying to you? How did David have such an amazing response? Well, it's interesting. When you read David's Psalms, and then you watch his behavior in 1 Samuel, sometimes you wonder how that could be the same guy. In the Psalms, he's so concerned about getting justice from God. Lord, make this right. I'm being treated unfairly. Give me justice. I'm in the right here. And he's always crying out to God for justice, saying, I'm innocent in this matter. But then we watch him in 1 Samuel, and when we watch him in 1 Samuel, we see a guy who just seems to be oblivious to whether or not he receives justice or injustice. He doesn't even seem to care. Why is there that disparity between David's prayer life and his actions with Saul? I think the reason is because for David, justice was a matter between him and God. It was just a matter between him and God. David fully trusted God to bring him justice. He sought justice only from God. And then that freed him up in his dealings with people to just be loving and to be humble. And to not worry about getting fairness from them. Not worry about what he got from them. His life was not a fight for his own rights because he entrusted all that to God. And when he sought it from God, he sought it earnestly and eagerly, but he didn't fight for it from people. Instead of his life was a life of serving and loving and honoring people. That was David's life. He was able to respond the way he did because he had insight into a very important and very precious and exceedingly beautiful attribute of God, His justice. That's what I want to talk about this morning, God's justice. Justice is taking what's wrong and making it right. Taking what's wrong and making it right. And God loves doing that. This is part of His nature that He loves doing that. If people take things from you, steal something from you, take away your reputation, take away your income, take away anything else from you, take away your time, God can pay you back far more than what they took. He's able to do that, right? He's able. He can do it. But will He do it? He will if you seek justice from Him. Now, ultimately, He will. On Judgment Day, we know on the final Judgment Day, God is going to make all wrongs right. We know that. We understand that. But what about in this life? Does God always make everything come out even in this life? No. Absolutely no. So what determines whether He grants you justice in a certain individual case or not? A number of things determine that, but one of the biggest is whether or not you seek justice from Him and then wait for it from Him. Okay? Now, for some of you, I realize this may be a totally new concept. Some of you would never dream of asking God for justice. There's probably some of you in this room who would never say, God, give me justice. Because you've been taught not to do that. You've been taught that since you deserve nothing but hell, the last thing you want to ever ask God for is justice. In fact, you may have even heard me say that, because I think I used to teach that. People who teach that say, look, no matter how bad you're being treated, you are receiving, whatever you're receiving is far better treatment than what you deserve, which is hell, so just keep your mouth shut. And if you're one of the people that believe that way, I hope you don't carry that philosophy into life in the way that you act, like into your parenting. One of your kids treats his brother unfairly, I hope you don't say, well, you just deserve nothing but pain anyway, so don't complain. We don't treat our... somebody busted your toy. 2 years ago you broke my expensive lamp. You still haven't paid that off. You're not even yet, so anyone can break any of your stuff they want. We don't treat our kids that way. That would be unfair, right? That would be unjust. And I'm glad the government doesn't use that approach, right? Your neighbor breaks into your house, steals all your stuff. They catch him, bring him before the judge. The judge says, you just deserve hell anyway, so he can keep your stuff. God doesn't do that. He does not transfer guilt from one area of your life into another circumstance. He doesn't bleed it over across the lines. He knows where you're guilty and where you're not. If you're in a conflict right now, and you are the one who's in the right in this particular conflict, then you are in the right. And even if you've been in the wrong 1,000 times before, it doesn't change the fact that in this particular case, you're in the right. An unfair parking ticket is unfair even if you're guilty of some other crime. If you've always thought of God's justice in a kind of a negative way, justice equals wrath, justice equals punishment, justice equals judgment, that's a misconception. That's not what we see in Scripture. If you look up all the times God's justice is mentioned in the Psalms, you'll notice that mostly it's grouped up not with wrath and punishment and all that. Sometimes it is, but mostly you see it grouped with words like mercy and kindness and benevolence and love. Justice is a merciful thing that God grants to people who are being treated unfairly. Psalm 103:6, the Lord works righteousness and justice for all the oppressed. If you're oppressed, God will come and give you justice. He'll make things right. Isaiah 30:18, the Lord longs to be gracious to you. He rises to show you compassion, for the Lord is a God of justice. He shows compassion not in spite of His justice, but because of His justice. God shows us mercy by making things right when life is unfair. That's His justice. Life's not fair, but it should be. It should be. It's not right that it's unfair. Injustice and unfairness are painful things that we endure and they cause us to suffer because God has built into us an appetite for justice. You ever notice how it bothers you? It just really bugs you when something happens to you that's unfair, and it doesn't even cost you anything. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't cost you anything. There's no real big deal, but it still bugs you just because it's unfair. That's because of a God-implanted appetite of your soul for justice. And it's an appetite of your soul that's good because it's a longing for something that is an actual attribute of God. God is just. And so it's good to desire justice. It's a good appetite. God gave you appetites because He wanted you to fulfill the appetites. He gave you a stomach that makes you hungry from time to time because He wanted you to eat food. He gave you a mouth that gets thirsty because He wanted you to drink water. And He gave you a soul that craves justice because He wanted you to seek justice from Him. So it's fitting when something is unfair that it should be painful. That's not you being a wimp. That's you desiring justice. It's a wonderful blessing. And it's promised to us very often. And God expects those promises to be motivating to us. He holds justice out here and He expects that to motivate us because we want that justice.